Hello and welcome to this very short lecture covering really the 1990s, but mostly the presidencies of George H.W. Bush all the way through to the massively controversial election of the year 2000. In 1980, George H.W. Bush campaigned for the Republican nomination for president. He lost, but he was chosen as a running mate for Ronald Reagan, who then ultimately won the election. As vice president, Bush had responsibility in several domestic areas, including federal deregulation of the airlines and an anti drug program. He also visited scores of foreign countries, so he was the obvious successor to Ronald Reagan when his two terms were over. And in 1988, he won the Republican nomination for president and then defeated Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis in the general election. Bush faced a dramatically changed world. The Cold War ended after 40 years, and the communist empire of the Soviet Union broke up. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The reformist president, Mikhail Gorbachev, who George W. Bush had supported, resigned. Now, while Bush hailed the march of democracy in Eastern Europe, he insisted on restraint towards these new emerging countries who were coming out of what used to be the Soviet Union. In other areas of foreign policy, however, President George H.W. Bush was much more aggressive. He sent troops into Panama to overthrow the corrupt regime of General Manuel Noriega, who was threatening the security of the Panama Canal and the lives of the Americans living there. Noriega was ultimately captured, brought to the United States, charged as a drug trafficker, and convicted. But Bush's greatest test came when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and then threatened to move into Saudi Arabia. Vowing to free Kuwait, Bush rallied the United Nations, the United States people, and Congress and sent 400,000, 25,000 American troops, joined by 118,000 troops from allied nations. After weeks of air and missile bombardment, a 100-hour land battle dubbed Operation Desert Storm routed Iraq's million-man army. Now, critically, after the war, George H.W. Bush was going to allow Saddam Hussein to remain in power in Iraq, punting the issue to his son, George W. Bush, in the 2000s. Now, this should have put George H.W. Bush in an excellent position going into a re-election campaign in 1992. But a couple of things happened because Democrat Bill Clinton is going to defeat incumbent Republican President George H.W. Bush. There's a few things that happen here. First, and this is really, really unusual, but George H.W. Bush has to go through a primary challenge. Normally, incumbent presidents aren't challenged in any serious ways in its party's primaries. That wasn't the case. George H.W. Bush faced a massive challenge by Pat Buchanan, and he kind of barely sort of squeaked through that. After getting through the primary, he then had to deal with an independent third party candidate, Ross Perot. Ross Perot would secure almost 19% of the total vote, the highest percentage of any third party candidate in a US election in 80 years, and almost all those votes were Republicans. He also faced Clinton, who was unknown, but who did very, very well in the debates. He ran on the strength of his middle of the road approach and his apparent sympathy for the concerns of ordinary Americans, saying, "I feel your pain," which became a sort of catchphrase that he would use from time to time. But ultimately, what happens is Bush and Perot split to some extent the Republican base. And so in the Electoral College, even though the popular vote was looked pretty close, the victory for Clinton in the Electoral College was fairly dramatic: 370 electoral votes to Bush's 168. And this ended 12 years of Republican control over the presidency. During the administration of William Jefferson Clinton, the United States enjoyed peace and economic prosperity. In fact, perhaps more economic prosperity than any time in its history. He was the first Democratic president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt to win a second term, which he did easily in 1996. He could point to the lowest unemployment rate in modern times, the lowest inflation in 30 years, the highest percentage of home ownership in the country's history, dropping crime rates all around, and reduced people on welfare. He proposed the first balanced budget in decades and was the first president in a long time to achieve a budget surplus. Now, a lot of this has to do, of course, with the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War meant that military spending could be reduced dramatically. As a part of a plan to celebrate the millennium in 2000, Clinton even called for a great national incentive to end racial discrimination. But Clinton's presidency was not without scandal. In November of 1995, Clinton began an affair with Monica Lewinsky, a 21-year-old unpaid intern in the White House. Over the course of a year and a half, the president and Miss Lewinsky had about a dozen sexual encounters in the White House. In April 1996, Lewinsky was then transferred to the Pentagon. That summer, she confided in a Pentagon co-worker about her sexual relationship with the president. In 1997, with the relationship over, this person began to secretly record conversations with Lewinsky, in which Lewinsky gave details about the affair. In December of that year, 1997, lawyers for Paula Joan, who was a different person suing the president on sexual harassment charges, subpoenaed Ms. Lewinsky to testify. In January of 1998, allegedly under the recommendation of President Clinton, Lewinsky filed an affidavit in which she denied ever having a sexual relationship with him. 5 days later, the person with the secret recordings contacted the office of the special counsel who was dealing with the matter and brought those recordings to him. Ms. Lewinsky was ultimately offered immunity if she agreed to cooperate and provide truthful evidence against the president. A few days later, the story broke, and Clinton publicly denied the allegations, saying, quote, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky," end quote. The impeachment proceedings themselves revolved around, of all things, the word sex. Clinton would later admit that he had relations with Miss Lewinsky, but denied ever having sex with her, which is what he testified to the grand jury. So the trial was really a perjury trial. There's a lot more to it than that, but the impeachment trial revolved around whether or not Bill Clinton had perjured himself as a result of all of the special investigations. At this point, the House of Representatives was under Republican control, and on December the 19th, 1998, the House voted to impeach Bill Clinton. He, at that point, became the second president in United States history to be impeached, the first being Andrew Johnson. However, in the Senate, which was still in Democratic control, no one got even close to the percentage needed to remove him from office. 45 Democrats and 10 Republicans voted not guilty on the charge of obstruction of justice. And even on some of the other charges, when it got a little closer, it was still split 50-50, not even remotely enough to get the 2/3 necessary to remove Clinton from office. That being said, the whole affair left a scar on the Clinton presidency going forward. But for most Americans, the 1990s were a dramatic period of change in their personal lives, and change really thanks to technology. This is known as the tech boom, also known as the dot-com boom or the tech bubble. Really, this was all driven by computers and superconductors. The growing power of the internet, which was becoming a thing really for the first time, the rise of entertainment culture, and the advance of technology in collecting even DNA all come together in 1998. We have all of a sudden crazy new innovations. The 90s see the world's first fully televised war. We see satellite GPS for the first time, business changes. Apple becomes dominant, Microsoft becomes a thing. Napster, which was a music exchange site, starts. There's increased globalization Air travel becomes less expensive and more readily available for everyone. Arguably, the technological changes that happened during the 90s are just as important as the technological changes that sweep America in the 1910s and 1920s. In the 1910s and 1920s, what you're talking about is change really driven by electricity. And in the 1990s, what you're really talking about is change driven by computers and computer technology. And that brings me to the final topic, the election of 2000. The election of 2000 was one of the closest elections in American history. It all came down to one state, Florida, and its 25 electoral votes. Whoever won Florida would win the presidency. By the close of the election night, George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, led Al Gore in Florida by a total of only 535 votes. So the election pitted former Vice President Al Gore versus George W. Bush, the present governor of the state of Texas. After a wild election night on November the 7th, 2000, during which TV networks first called the state of Florida for Gore, then they called it for Bush, followed by a concession by Gore, which he then rescinded, resulted at the end of the night in a situation where whoever was going to be the 43rd president was just too close to call. In the 36 days that followed, Americans discovered that Al Gore had won the popular vote by about 500,000 votes. But it's winning the Electoral College that counts. As accusations of fraud and voter suppression, calls for recounts, and the filing of lawsuits ensued, the term for the first time, hanging Chad, dimpled Chads, pregnant Chads, for the first time became part of the lexicon. You can see a video, an image to the left of the screen there, which is from the election of 2000, wherein someone is trying to determine whether or not a voter intended to vote for Al Gore or George W. Bush because they might not have punched the punch card all the way through. That's the hanging or dimpled Chad. Over the next few weeks, with no winner yet determined, officials conducted an electronic recount in which ballots were refed into the same machines. But then Gore asked for a hand recount. At this point, the ballots themselves become an issue of contention. Some were visually confusing. Some were like these, what they called butterfly ballots, in which there's a column of candidate names separated by a middle column to be punched through. So there were allegations that people couldn't tell who they were voting for, and so they accidentally voted for the wrong person or accidentally voted for the Green Party candidate when they meant to vote for Al Gore, or maybe the third party Republican candidate, Pat Buchanan, because things weren't lining up. This looked like it was going to go on forever. Although I will say it was totally peaceful. There were no tanks in the streets like you might see in other nations. They managed to get through the whole thing through the court system, and that's where it came to an end. By a 5-4 decision, split totally along party lines, the Supreme Court decided to step in and stop the recount. By stopping the recount of the votes, where it was, George W. Bush, being ahead of Al Gore, was awarded all 25 electoral votes for the state of Florida and won the presidency, becoming president in the year 2000. Of course, it was only a couple of months after he became president that terrorists hijacking planes attacked the Twin Towers in New York, starting a whole new period of American history.